You walk into a hospital built in 1910. It still stands. The records exist. The architects are documented. The funding sources are traceable. Now try to find a hospital from 1850, not a description of one, not a painting, not a mention in a letter. An actual building, one that was used as a hospital before 1850, that still functions or still stands in its original form, with its original purpose intact. You will find almost nothing, and that absence, that specific, repeated global absence, is what this investigation is about. We are told that medicine existed before 1900. We are told that cities had medical facilities. We are told that wars produced field hospitals, that plagues produced quarantine centers, that major urban populations had somewhere to send the sick and dying. The historical record insists these places existed. But the buildings are gone, not damaged, not converted, not repurposed beyond recognition. Gone. And the question that the official timeline quietly avoids is not whether they existed. It is why none of them remain. The standard explanation for the disappearance of pre-1900 medical infrastructure follows a familiar pattern. We are told that early hospitals were primitive, that they were temporary structures, wooden, unstable, not meant to last. That as medicine modernized in the late 19th century, the old facilities were torn down and replaced with more sanitary, more functional buildings. Progress, in other words, consumed what came before it. This explanation is reasonable on its surface, but it begins to develop problems when you examine it against the physical record. The same cities that supposedly had only primitive wooden medical structures, structures too degraded to preserve, still contain stone churches from the 11th century, Roman aqueducts, medieval guild halls, warehouses, prisons, and administrative buildings from the 1600s and 1700s that have survived wars, fires, and industrial development. Entire neighborhoods of pre-industrial architecture still stand across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The selective disappearance of one specific category of building, the medical facility, requires an explanation that goes beyond material fragility. Stone does not selectively decay when it was used for medical purposes. Brick does not deteriorate faster because sick people once lay inside it. The official explanation accounts for primitive construction. It does not account for why that primitive construction applied only to hospitals and not to the hundreds of other building types from the same period that still exist. There is a class of institution that complicates this further: the almshouse, the poorhouse, and the infirmary. In Britain, France, Germany, and across colonial North America, these institutions were documented extensively in written records. They appear in census data, in municipal budgets, in the correspondence of administrators and reformers. Charles Dickens wrote about them. Parliamentary commissions investigated them. They were not secret. They were not obscure. And yet the physical structures, the actual buildings where these functions occurred, are almost entirely absent from the landscape. What remains, in most cases, is a converted structure, a building that is now a museum, a hotel, a private residence, or a ruin, with a small plaque noting that it once served some vaguely medical or charitable function. The original layout, the original infrastructure, the original medical arrangements, gone or unrecognizable. This pattern appears across countries that had no contact with each other's demolition decisions. The absence is not regional. It is not the result of a single war or a single fire. It is distributed, consistent, global in a way that localized explanations struggle to address. This raises a technical problem. If hospitals were demolished as medicine modernized, that process would have been uneven. Some cities would have preserved old facilities. Some institutions would have been too expensive to demolish and simply repurposed intact. Some would have survived in rural areas where development pressure was low. The normal pattern of architectural survival, patchy, inconsistent, driven by local economics and local decisions, should have left some significant pre-1850 medical structures standing somewhere. The near-total absence of such structures suggests something more systematic than ordinary modernization. Let us look at what the record does contain. There are illustrations. There are written descriptions. There are administrative documents describing the layout and function of pre-industrial medical facilities. The Hotel Dieu in Paris, for instance, is documented as one of the oldest hospitals in continuous operation in the world. Its origins are traced to the 7th century. It still operates today, but the building that operates today is not the building from the 7th century, or the 12th, or the 15th. The current structure dates primarily from rebuilding efforts in the 19th century. Earlier versions were demolished, burned, or collapsed. What survived is the name, the institutional continuity, and the records, not the physical structure. This is the pattern. Institutional names persist. Records persist. But the buildings that house those institutions across many centuries have been replaced, almost without exception, by structures built after 1850. The Hotel Dieu was not unusual. It is representative. Across Europe, the oldest named hospitals trace their physical structures to post-1850 construction. The institution may claim centuries of history, but the walls you can touch date from a period of rapid rebuilding that coincides precisely with the industrialization of medicine. What happened to the walls that came before? One answer offered by historians is fire. Pre-industrial urban environments were highly combustible. The Great Fire of London in 1666, the fires that periodically destroyed large sections of medieval European cities. The burning of cities during wars. Fire, the argument goes, consumed what time had not yet claimed. This explanation holds partial weight. Fire did destroy significant amounts of pre-industrial architecture, but it does not explain the global pattern, because the same argument cannot apply to regions where fire was not a significant factor, and where other institutional buildings from the same period survived. Consider the Byzantine Empire. It maintained sophisticated urban infrastructure, including documented medical facilities connected to monasteries and imperial patronage. Byzantine architectural remains exist across Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Churches from the 6th century still stand. Fortifications from the 10th century remain partially intact. But Byzantine medical facilities, buildings documented as functioning hospices and treatment centers, exist today almost exclusively as ruins or foundations, stripped of their original form. The fire explanation does not apply uniformly to the Byzantine case. The issue is not combustion. It is selective structural disappearance. The same question surfaces in the Islamic world, where the Bimaristan, a formal medical institution with documented layouts, documented patients, and documented medical staff, appears in records across Persia, Egypt, Syria, and Andalusia from the 9th century onward. Physical remains of these structures are sparse. Where ruins exist, they are shells. The interior arrangements, the functional infrastructure, the medical systems embedded in the architecture, absent. The evidence doesn't disappear. Only the explanation does. There is a related problem in the documentary record itself. For most categories of pre-industrial building, we have not just descriptions but construction records. Medieval cathedrals come with accounts of how they were financed, who the master builders were, how long construction took, where the materials came from. Secular buildings, palaces, bridges, fortifications are similarly documented, often in remarkable detail. For pre-industrial hospitals, this documentation is thin in ways that seem disproportionate to the institutional importance of these facilities. We know that the Hotel Dieu existed in the medieval period. We do not have detailed construction records explaining how it was organized, heated, ventilated, or maintained across its early centuries. We know the Bimaristan of Al-Nouri was built in Damascus in the 12th century. We have descriptions of its courts and its physicians. We do not have comprehensive records of how it was built or what specific architectural systems it used. The question is not whether these institutions were real. They were. The question is why the documentation for their physical construction and maintenance is significantly thinner than the documentation we have for other institutional buildings of the same period. Silence where record should exist is itself a kind of evidence. It does not prove anything. But it is a pattern worth noting, and the pattern here is consistent enough to merit scrutiny. Now consider what was being demolished in the specific window between roughly 1850 and 1910. This is the period historians identify as the transformation of medicine, germ theory, antisepsis, anesthesia, the formalization of nursing, the professionalization of surgery. All of these developments are dated to this window. It is presented as a sudden, dramatic modernization of medical knowledge. What physically accompanied this transformation was an equally dramatic rebuilding of medical infrastructure. Across Europe and North America, new hospitals were constructed on a massive scale. The architecture of these new hospitals was explicitly justified by new understandings of ventilation, sanitation, and patient separation. The old facilities were described as unhygienic, dangerous, incompatible with modern medical knowledge. And they were demolished. The pace and completeness of that demolition is worth examining. Cities did not preserve one old hospital as a record of how medicine was practiced before modernization. They did not maintain a single example in each country as an architectural and historical reference. Across dozens of countries, across hundreds of cities, the pre-modern medical infrastructure was removed and replaced within the same half-century. That kind of coordinated, geographically distributed replacement is unusual in architectural history. It suggests either that an extraordinary amount of pre-modern medical infrastructure was destroyed in a very short time, or that there was significantly less of it than the historical record implies, or both. The official explanation accounts for the modernization of medicine. It does not account for why the physical transition was so complete, so fast, and so global. There is a subset of this question that concerns what the demolished buildings would have told us. Medical facilities encode information about the medical knowledge of the people who built them. The layout of a hospital reflects theories of disease transmission, theories of patient care, theories of the relationship between environment and health. When you can examine the physical structure, you can read the embedded assumptions of the builders. When you cannot examine the structure, when only written descriptions survive, you are dependent on the accuracy and completeness of those descriptions, and written descriptions of historical medical facilities have a consistent characteristic. They are administrative and institutional in nature. They record who funded the facility, who administered it, who the prominent physicians were. They do not typically record the technical details of construction, the specifications of ventilation systems, or the physical arrangements that reflect medical theory. This means that whatever the builders of pre-1850 medical facilities understood about disease, environment, and treatment, whatever knowledge was embedded in the physical structure of those buildings, is largely inaccessible to us now. We cannot verify it, we cannot contradict it, we cannot examine it, and that gap between what the record claims existed and what we can actually examine is precisely the kind of gap that raises the possibility that the history we have received is incomplete in ways we have not fully accounted for. There is one more pattern that is difficult to explain within the standard framework. The medical knowledge that appears in written records from the ancient and medieval world is, in places, more sophisticated than the timeline of medical development would suggest. Roman physicians described procedures and observations that would not be formally re-established until the 19th century. Medieval Islamic physicians recorded pharmaceutical and surgical knowledge that European medicine would claim to rediscover centuries later. The standard explanation is that this knowledge was lost and found again, that the fall of Rome, the destruction of libraries, the disruptions of plague and war severed the transmission of medical understanding, and that later physicians genuinely rediscovered what their predecessors had known. This explanation is possible, but it creates a specific problem when placed beside the physical record. If sophisticated medical knowledge existed in the ancient and medieval world, if it was sophisticated enough to produce the documented medical observations and treatments we find in surviving texts, then the facilities in which that medicine was practiced should reflect some of that sophistication. The physical infrastructure of medicine and the intellectual content of medicine cannot be too far apart for very long, but the physical record, to the extent it exists at all, is described in terms that suggest only basic, primitive conditions. The contradiction between the sophistication of written medical knowledge and the apparent primitiveness of the physical facilities that supposedly housed it is rarely addressed directly. Either the facilities were more sophisticated than the physical record suggests, which would imply the structures were deliberately or systematically removed before they could be examined, or that written medical knowledge was more theoretical than practical, produced by scholars disconnected from actual medical infrastructure. Neither explanation is comfortable. Neither has been resolved. What we are left with is a specific, verifiable absence. You can confirm this yourself. Try to identify a functioning hospital building or a substantially intact hospital ruin from before 1800 in any major city. Not a monastery with a sick ward. Not a building that may have had medical functions. A structure built specifically as a medical facility, identifiable as such, with enough physical integrity to examine its layout and infrastructure. In most cities, in most countries, you will not find one. You will find records of institutions. You will find the names of physicians. You will find accounts of treatments and epidemics and administrative disputes. But the buildings are not there. This is not a minor gap. Medical facilities are among the most important institutional structures in any organized society. They reflect the priorities, the knowledge, and the resources of the civilization that built them. Their absence from the physical record, in a period where so much other physical evidence has survived, is a structural anomaly that the history of architecture and medicine has not adequately explained. The standard narrative of medical history moves from primitive to modern, from ignorance to knowledge, from crude facilities to sophisticated institutions. It requires that what came before the 19th century was less advanced, less worthy of preservation, and therefore reasonably discarded. But that narrative is circular. We conclude that pre-modern medicine was primitive partly because the physical evidence of what it actually built does not exist. And the physical evidence does not exist partly because it was demolished during the period when the narrative of medical primitivism was being established. The logic that justified the demolition and the conclusion that resulted from the demolition are the same logic. That is not how evidence is supposed to work. The institutions that now curate medical history, museums, universities, medical associations, preserve instruments, documents, and records from the pre-modern period. They do not, in any systematic way, preserve or reconstruct the physical spaces of pre-modern medicine. This is presented as a practical matter. The buildings were demolished. You cannot preserve what no longer exists. But you can reconstruct, you can create working models. You can apply the same forensic archaeology that has reconstructed Roman kitchens, Viking shipbuilding techniques, and medieval agricultural systems to the question of what pre-modern hospitals actually looked like and how they actually functioned. That reconstruction has not happened at any significant scale. The question of what pre-1800 medical facilities were actually built like, what knowledge they encoded, what systems they used, what their physical form reveals about the medicine practiced within them, remains largely unasked by the institutions most equipped to answer it. They describe what existed. They do not examine how it existed. And that distinction between acknowledging the past and actually investigating it is where the gap sits. There is a further dimension to this that involves the relationship between medical infrastructure and population scale. Historical records suggest that several pre-industrial cities reached populations that would have required substantial medical infrastructure to function. Rome at its peak is estimated to have held between 1 and 2 million people. Constantinople, Baghdad, and Chang'an each reached populations in the hundreds of thousands during their respective periods of greatest development. These were not small settlements. They were dense, complex urban environments where epidemic disease, injury, and chronic illness would have been continuous, large-scale problems. The medical infrastructure implied by those population sizes has not survived in physical form. What has survived are references, brief mentions in administrative texts, passing descriptions in travelers' accounts, fragmentary records of physicians attached to imperial courts or religious institutions. For a city of 1 million people, managing disease and injury at scale requires more than a few physicians and a monastery ward. It requires logistics. It requires supply chains for medicines and materials. It requires buildings designed to receive, sort, and treat large numbers of patients. The organizational complexity alone should have left a more substantial physical and documentary trace than what we have. The gap between the implied scale of pre-industrial urban medicine and the physical evidence that survives is not small. It is proportionally larger than the gap we see in almost any other domain of ancient infrastructure. Roman roads still exist. Roman drainage systems still function in parts of Europe. Roman amphitheaters still stand. The physical absence of Roman medical infrastructure, at a scale proportional to the cities it would have served, has not been satisfactorily explained. There is also a pattern visible in how medical knowledge was transmitted across generations. In most technical fields, knowledge transmission leaves physical evidence. The tools of a craft survive. The workshops survive. The apprentice records survive. The progression from crude early attempts to refined later techniques is visible in the archaeological record across dozens of industries: metalworking, ceramics, textile production, architecture itself. Medical knowledge transmission shows a different pattern. Texts survive. Commentaries on texts survive. But the practical, physical dimension of medical education, the facilities where students learned, the equipment they trained on, the spaces where technique was demonstrated and practiced, is almost entirely absent from the pre-modern record. This matters because it raises a question about the nature of the medical knowledge recorded in those surviving texts. Detailed surgical descriptions require hands-on training to produce. Pharmaceutical knowledge requires laboratory-equivalent spaces to develop and verify. The level of technical specificity visible in some pre-modern medical texts implies a practical, institutional basis for that knowledge, a basis that should have left physical evidence. When the physical evidence is absent and only the text survives, it is difficult to determine whether the knowledge was practically applied or theoretically constructed. That distinction is significant. A civilization that understood medicine theoretically and one that practiced it institutionally at scale would look very different in the archaeological record. Pre-modern medicine appears in the record primarily as theory. The institutional, practical dimension is largely invisible. Whether that invisibility reflects what was actually there or reflects a gap in what was preserved is a question the current state of the evidence cannot resolve. One additional detail is worth noting before this investigation closes: the period between 1850 and 1910, during which pre-modern medical infrastructure was demolished and replaced, was also a period of significant institutional consolidation in medicine. Medical licensing bodies were established. Medical schools were formally accredited. The definition of legitimate medical practice was narrowed and standardized. The informal, distributed, and locally varied medical traditions that had existed across many cultures were progressively delegitimized and replaced by a single, centralized model of professional medicine. Physical infrastructure followed that consolidation. The new hospitals built in this period were not just more sanitary than their predecessors. They were architecturally and institutionally standardized in ways that the older, more varied facilities were not. They were built to accommodate the new professional model, organized around the physician, the laboratory, and the surgical theater. The older facilities, whatever their actual characteristics, did not fit that model. They were associated with medical traditions that the consolidating profession was explicitly distancing itself from. Their demolition was framed as sanitary necessity, but it also had the effect of removing physical evidence of alternative medical traditions and alternative approaches to organizing care. What those older facilities actually represented, what knowledge they embedded, what systems they used, what their physical form implied about how medicine was understood and practiced, cannot now be easily examined, because the buildings are gone. And the question that remains, sitting in that absence, is not whether pre-modern medicine was better or worse than what replaced it. That question may not be answerable. The question is whether the physical removal of that infrastructure was as neutral and inevitable as the official account suggests. Progress requires clearing space. But it does not always require destroying every trace of what existed before. The fact that it happened here, consistently and globally, in a very short window of time, suggests that the clearing served a purpose beyond simple modernization. What that purpose was, the physical record no longer says. The records say hospitals existed. The buildings do not confirm it, and the institutions that replace them have shown little interest in finding out why.